Dear Libra, before you relax, before you scroll, before you tell yourself this is probably not for me, let me ask you something. Have you felt it? That quiet pressure in your chest. That sense that something in your life is no longer wrong, but no longer tolerable either. Not dramatic, just heavy enough to wake you up. Because January 9th, 2026 doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives the moment you realize you can't keep balancing a life that keeps costing you yourself. This isn't about fate, and it's not another promise. It's about the exact second you stop negotiating with your own truth. If you've been holding your breath to keep the peace, if you've been waiting for clarity that never came, this moment may be closer than you think. Stay with me. And before we go further, leave a quiet mark below. Just one word. I'm here. Because what comes next may change the way you see your entire story. January 9th, 2026 doesn't arrive with noise. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask for permission. It arrives the way truth usually does. Quiet, personal, undeniable. And I'm not talking to everyone right now. I'm talking to you, the Libra who has mastered the art of staying composed while something inside slowly leans out of alignment. The one who smiles through conversations that cost more energy than they should. The one who keeps the peace so well that no one notices what it takes to maintain it. This day doesn't push you. It doesn't demand action. It simply places a mirror in front of you and waits. You don't wake up different. You wake up honest. Honest about the weight you've been carrying quietly. Honest about how long you've been adjusting yourself to fit spaces that never adjusted back. Honest about the fact that balance, when it comes at the expense of your own truth, is no longer balance at all. And that realization doesn't crash in. It settles, like a scale that has been held steady for too long suddenly releasing its grip. Not dramatic, just precise. You don't change gradually here. You recognize everything at once, what no longer feels right in your body, what you've been tolerating out of habit, not alignment. What can't be carried forward if you want a life that actually feels like yours. This shift doesn't come from the outside world rearranging itself. It comes from a quiet sentence forming inside you. One you don't say out loud at first. I can't keep living slightly against myself. And the moment you let that thought finish, something loosens. Your shoulders drop. Your breath deepens. Not because the answers are here yet, but because the pretending has ended. That's the turn. Not the kind people applaud, the kind only you feel. And here's what makes this moment different. You're not doing this in reaction. You're doing it in recognition. You're no longer asking what would be fair to everyone else. You're noticing what has been quietly unfair to you. That's not selfish. That's clarity. And clarity has a way of changing the atmosphere before anything else moves. Have you noticed how certain thoughts feel heavier than others? Not because they're negative, but because they're untrue to who you've become. Those thoughts start falling away now, not forcefully, naturally. You don't have to burn bridges here. You don't have to announce your awakening. The shift is subtler than that. It shows up in what you no longer explain, in what you stop negotiating, in the pauses you allow yourself before saying yes. This is the moment the inner scale begins to recalibrate on its own. And as that balance resets, something else begins to surface. A question that doesn't rush you, but waits patiently, like it knows you'll answer when you're ready. What would your life feel like if you didn't have to keep proving your worth to keep the peace? Let that question breathe. Because what comes next isn't about changing your world all at once. It's about understanding why everything has been held exactly where it was until now. And that understanding is already moving toward you. And once that question settles inside you, something else becomes clear. Not all at once, but gently, like light moving across a room you've been sitting in for years. You've been waiting for a long time, Libra. Not because you were unsure, not because you lacked courage, but because you carried an unspoken responsibility to keep everything balanced. You learned early how to read the room, how to sense tension before it spoke, how to adjust your tone, your timing, even your truth, so the air stayed calm. And for a while, that felt like wisdom. It felt like maturity. It felt like love. But here's the part no one ever told you. When you hold the scale for everyone else, you end up standing still while life waits for you to move. You delayed decisions not because you were afraid to choose, but because choosing meant someone else might feel uncomfortable. You gave second chances not because you didn't see the pattern, but because you hoped harmony could be restored if you stayed patient enough. You remained in places that no longer fit, not because you didn't know better, but because leaving felt like tipping the balance too far. And somewhere along the way, waiting became your role. Not passive waiting, active waiting, the kind that takes effort, the kind that costs energy. This is the reframe most people miss. You were never behind. You were carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. Emotional weight, unspoken expectations, other people's comfort layered on top of your own needs. January 9th doesn't demand that you confront anyone. It doesn't push you to make a grand announcement. It simply marks the moment you realize what you've been holding. And more importantly, what happens when you set it down. Because the instant you stop managing what doesn't belong to you, movement returns. Not chaos, not disruption. Motion. Things that felt frozen begin to shift at the same time. Conversations change tone. Opportunities breathe. Again, your body responds before your mind catches up. There's relief in your chest. Not because everything is solved, but because something has finally been released. And here's the quiet truth. Waiting was not wasted time. It was a period of calibration. You were learning discernment, learning how to tell the difference between compromise and self-erasure. Learning that peace maintained at your own expense is not peace at all. That understanding doesn't arrive with guilt. It arrives with compassion. You don't judge your past self here. You thank them for holding on as long as they did, for keeping things steady when it mattered. But now, something else is asking for your attention. A softer responsibility, one that points inward. What would it feel like to let life respond to you instead of you constantly responding to life? Sit with that for a moment. Because as soon as you stop waiting to keep everything balanced, something deeper begins to surface. Not urgency, not pressure, but a quiet unraveling of an old role you've outgrown. And in that unraveling, a different kind of understanding begins to form. One that explains not just why you waited, but why certain things could not move until you were ready to meet them differently. That understanding is already approaching. Slowly, intentionally. And when it arrives, it won't feel like delay anymore. It will feel like timing. And as that understanding settles, something deeper begins to happen. Not outside of you, inside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with panic or urgency. It arrives as a quiet exhaustion you can no longer ignore. You grow tired, Libra. Not the kind of tired that sleep can fix. The kind that comes from constantly explaining who you are, from softening your edges so others can stay comfortable, from holding harmony together by slowly stepping away from yourself. You may have told yourself this was maturity, that being agreeable meant being evolved, that keeping the peace was a sign of wisdom. But something inside you knows the difference now. You're not burned out from doing too much. You're worn down from being too little in places where you once felt whole. This is not a crisis. It just feels like one because the old structure is giving way. There is a version of you that has been quietly collapsing. Not in chaos, in relief, the version that measured every word before speaking. The version that paused instinctively to ask if something would be fair to everyone else. The version that learned to translate your truth into something more digestible. That version did its job. It kept things steady when they needed to be steady. It protected relationships when you didn't yet know how to protect yourself. But it can't come with you anymore. And that realization may feel strange at first. Because nothing dramatic is happening on the surface. Life looks the same. People sound the same. Yet inside, there's a shift you can't reverse. You stop rehearsing explanations in your head. You stop adjusting your tone before you even speak. You notice the moment you almost shrink, and something in you gently refuses, not out of anger, out of honesty. This is what the internal collapse really is. Not destruction, but release. You're not losing yourself here. You're losing the habit of self-abandonment. There may be moments when this feels uncomfortable. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. Your nervous system has been trained to equate harmony with safety. And now safety is being redefined. Here's the part most people don't talk about. When you stop managing everyone else's emotional comfort, silence appears, a pause, a space. And in that space, something essential starts to breathe. You begin to feel your own weight again, your own preferences, your own limits. You realize how often you asked what was fair to them without ever asking if it was fair to you. And when that question finally lands, it doesn't accuse, it clarifies. Let me ask you something gently. What parts of yourself have you been editing just to keep the balance intact? You don't need to answer right now. Just notice what surfaces. Because this quiet unraveling isn't the end of something. It's the clearing before something honest can take shape. The collapse finishes its work softly, without spectacle, without apology. And as it does, a new kind of strength begins to form. Not loud, not performative, but steady enough to hold you without asking you to disappear. That strength is already present, waiting to be trusted. And once you feel it, even briefly, you'll understand why what comes next could never arrive until this version of you was ready to stand. And once that steadiness begins to take shape, something quietly returns to you. Not confidence, not certainty. Trust, not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that shows up as a calm knowing in your body before your mind even weighs in. You start to hear your own voice again, Libra. Not the anxious one that scans the room for reactions, not the one that softens its truth to avoid friction, but the voice that knows, the one that has always known. It doesn't rush you, it doesn't argue. It simply states what feels right and what doesn't, without apology. And that may feel unfamiliar at first, because for a long time, you learned to doubt yourself the moment someone else hesitated. You learned to pause your instincts until there was agreement. You learned to translate your inner truth into something easier for others to accept. But now, something has shifted. You don't need proof right away. You don't need to gather opinions. You don't need permission to trust what your body recognizes instantly. You notice it in small moments. in the way you don't over-explain a decision, in the way silence no longer feels like a threat, in the way you let a feeling pass through you without questioning its validity. This is not recklessness, it's coherence. You're no longer chasing consensus, you're listening for alignment. And that changes everything. Because when your inner world becomes consistent, the outer world starts responding differently. Not dramatically, naturally. You stop convincing people to understand you. And interestingly, the ones who matter don't need convincing anymore. You stop adjusting your tone to be more acceptable. And conversations either deepen or quietly fade without conflict. You stop second-guessing yourself after you've already decided. And the weight you've been carrying begins to lift. This is the return of self-trust, not as a personality trait, but as a lived experience. You feel it in your posture, in the way you enter a room, in the way your breath settles when you make a choice and stand by it. Let me ask you something gently. When was the last time you trusted yourself without immediately looking around to see who agreed? Sit with that, because this moment isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before you learned to doubt your own balance. And that remembering doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds, quietly, layer by layer. You may still feel moments of hesitation. That's natural. Old habits don't disappear overnight. But now, hesitation doesn't control you. It passes through. You notice it. You acknowledge it. And then you listen deeper. That deeper listening is what begins to guide your next steps. Not urgency, not pressure, just clarity that feels steady enough to stand on. And as that clarity settles in, something else begins to reorganize around it. Your choices, your boundaries, your sense of direction. You don't push forward here, you align. And alignment has a way of opening doors without force. As you rest into that knowing, allow yourself to notice what feels different already. Not outside, inside. Because this is the point where trust stops being an idea and becomes a compass. And once you start moving by that compass, the path ahead begins to reveal itself in ways that no amount of planning ever could. Just enough light, at just the right time. And as that inner compass steadies, something subtle begins to happen around you. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The way people relate to you starts to shift. Some connections loosen without conflict, no arguments, no explanations. Just a gentle drifting, like leaves separating from a branch when the season changes. You may notice it first in silence. Messages that slow down. Conversations that no longer ask for your constant presence. And instead of panic, there is an unexpected calm. Because deep down, you are no longer available to be managed, shaped, or gently controlled. There are people who were comfortable with you when you carried the balance for everyone, when you smoothed edges, when you absorbed tension so the room could stay peaceful. And now, something in you has shifted just enough that their grip no longer holds. Not because you've hardened, but because you've softened into yourself. You don't argue your boundaries. You don't announce them. You simply stop bending. And that alone changes the entire dynamic. Some relationships don't survive that kind of honesty, not because they were bad, but because they were built on a version of you that no longer exists. Others surprise you. They deepen. They feel quieter, more spacious. You notice how easy it is to be present without performing, how little effort it takes to be understood when you're not editing yourself in advance. There's no tension in your shoulders, no mental rehearsal before you speak, no instinct to soften your truth so it lands better. You show up as you are, and somehow that's enough. This is the recalibration. You're no longer chasing harmony through self-sacrifice. You're allowing harmony to meet you where you stand. That difference may seem small, but it changes everything. You may feel moments of grief here. For people who couldn't come with you. For versions of connection that required you to disappear, just, little. Let yourself feel that. Grief doesn't mean you chose wrong. It means you chose honestly. And in that honesty, something new enters your life. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. Connections that don't ask you to explain your sensitivity. People who don't rush your pauses. Relationships that feel like a quiet exhale instead of a constant negotiation. You recognize them not by intensity, but by ease. Let me ask you something gently. When was the last time you felt fully yourself in someone's presence without wondering how long it would last? Sit with that. Because the recalibration isn't about loss, it's about resonance. What falls away was never meant to hold you forever. What remains and what arrives meets you at the frequency you're now living from. And that frequency feels different in your body. You're not bracing anymore. You're not overgiving to earn closeness. You're not adjusting your truth to maintain connection. You're simply present. And presence has a way of reorganizing relationships without effort. As this new balance settles, notice how your world feels a little quieter, a little clearer. Because when your inner alignment changes, the people around you respond instinctively. And as those responses unfold, something else begins to reveal itself. Not in your relationships this time, but in how you value yourself in the world beyond them. And that shift is already beginning to take shape. And as that new balance settles in your relationships, something else begins to realign. Not loudly, not all at once, but deeply. It shows up first in how you see yourself when no one is watching. For a long time, Libra, your sense of value has been tied to response, to approval, to whether the people around you felt comfortable, satisfied, pleased. Not because you doubted your ability, but because you learned early that being liked felt safer than being fully seen. So you worked hard. You stayed flexible. You gave more than you asked for. And often you accepted less than you deserved. Not out of weakness, out of consideration. But something changes after this turning point. You begin to notice how tired that pattern made you. How much energy it took to keep proving your worth through cooperation. How often your work became about being agreeable instead of being aligned. And quietly, without drama, that stops. You don't wake up suddenly ambitious. You wake up selective. You start choosing work that feels like an extension of who you are, not a negotiation against it. You notice how your body responds differently when your effort is respected instead of merely tolerated. How your mind stays clearer when your contribution isn't constantly being measured against someone else's expectations. You're no longer working to be liked. You're working to be in integrity. And that shift matters. Because when your sense of value comes from within, money begins to move differently around you. Not magically, not overnight, but with less tension. You stop over-explaining your prices. You stop justifying your boundaries. You stop feeling guilty for wanting stability without self-erasure. And in that steadiness, opportunities respond. Not louder opportunities, calmer ones. The kind that don't demand all of you to prove something. The kind that meet you halfway. The kind that feels sustainable instead of draining. You may notice this as relief more than excitement. Bills feel easier to handle. Decisions feel clearer. The constant pressure to make everything work softens. Not because life suddenly becomes effortless, but because you're no longer fighting yourself inside it. Let me ask you something gently. What would change if you measured success by how peaceful your days feel, not by how impressed others are? Sit with that. Because this realignment isn't about chasing more. It's about carrying less weight that was never yours to begin with. You begin to trust that your value doesn't disappear when you say no, that your worth doesn't fluctuate based on someone else's comfort, that you can be fair without being self-sacrificing. And as that truth settles in, your relationship with work and money becomes quieter, more honest, more humane. You start to sense when something is aligned before the numbers even make sense. You feel when an agreement honors you instead of drains you. You notice how often clarity saves you more than effort ever did. This is the shift beneath the surface, the one most people miss, because it doesn't look like ambition, it looks like self-respect. And self-respect has a way of reorganizing resources without force. As you allow that new rhythm to guide you, notice how your body responds, how your breath deepens when your value is no longer up for negotiation. Because when your inner scales settle, the world begins to reflect that balance back to you in subtle, meaningful ways. And as that reflection continues, another layer begins to reveal itself, one that lives even deeper than work or money. It starts in the body, and as your sense of value steadies, your body begins to speak. Not in words, in signals you can't ignore anymore. You may notice it first at night. Sleep comes deeper. Not perfect, just honest. Your shoulders don't stay lifted the way they used to. Your jaw unclenches without effort. Breathing feels less like something you have to manage and more like something that carries you. For a long time, your body has been compensating, holding tension so you could keep everything else balanced, staying alert so nothing tipped too far in any direction. That kind of vigilance leaves marks, not dramatic ones, subtle ones. A tight chest when you had to say yes again. Shallow breaths when you felt the need to stay agreeable. A quiet fatigue that no amount of rest could fully touch. And now, something releases. Not because you fixed anything, but because you stopped forcing yourself into positions that required constant adjustment. Libra bodies are sensitive. They register imbalance before the mind catches up. They hold the truth quietly, waiting for you to listen. January 9th marks the moment your body stops bracing for a life that doesn't fit anymore. You may feel it in how you move through your day. There's less urgency in your steps, less guarding, less background noise inside your nervous system. This is not healing in the way people usually talk about it. There's no dramatic breakthrough, no single practice that changes everything. This is alignment settling in at a cellular level. Your body no longer needs to stay tense to protect your peace, because your peace is no longer being negotiated away. You don't wake up trying to hold yourself together. You wake up already held. And that changes how you meet the world. You're more present in conversations, not because you're trying harder, but because you're not disappearing. You listen without scanning for danger. You speak without rehearsing the aftermath. Let me ask you something, softly. When was the last time your body felt safe enough to simply exist without preparation? Notice what comes up. Because safety is not created by control. It's created by congruence. When your inner choices match your outer life, your body relaxes. It no longer needs to signal distress to get your attention. This is why rest feels different now. Why stillness doesn't feel uncomfortable. Why moments of silence no longer ask to be filled. You're not numb. You're regulated. and that regulation opens space for something deeper to emerge. You begin to sense your own rhythm again, not the pace you adopted to keep up, not the tempo that made others comfortable, your own, the one that doesn't rush clarity, the one that allows pauses, the one that trusts timing without forcing outcomes. You don't need to heal more to deserve this ease. You needed to stop living against your natural cadence. As your body confirms what your spirit already knows, another awareness begins to surface, quieter than thought, stronger than habit. It's the recognition that this shift is not just about relief. It's about direction. And as that direction starts to take shape, something else begins to call for your attention. Not from outside, from within, a deeper sense of why you're here and how you're meant to carry yourself forward from this point on. That understanding is forming now, slowly, intentionally, and you're already closer to it than you think. And as that deeper sense of direction begins to settle, you realize something quietly profound. This moment is not about arrival. It is about refusal. Refusal to keep living slightly out of alignment just to maintain appearances. Refusal to keep negotiating your needs into something smaller and more acceptable. Refusal to keep telling yourself that someday you will finally get back to who you are. This is the turning point. Not because everything suddenly becomes perfect, but because something inside you draws a clear line. You stop asking how much longer you can endure. You start asking how honestly you want to live. That shift changes how you move through your days. You choose with more clarity, not impulsively, deliberately. You say no sooner, not harshly, kindly. You notice the first moment something drains you instead of staying until you're empty. You don't argue with the signal. You listen. This isn't about control. It's about respect. Self-respect that doesn't need justification. For a long time, balance meant compromise at your own expense. It meant keeping things even by leaning away from yourself. It meant harmony that looked peaceful from the outside, while something inside stayed unsettled. That version of balance no longer fits. You don't chase it anymore. Instead, you begin to live from alignment. Alignment with your values, with your limits, with the quiet truth your body and spirit have been offering you all along. And alignment does something balance never could. It simplifies. You don't feel pulled in as many directions. You don't feel responsible for fixing what isn't yours. You don't feel guilty for choosing what feels right. You trust that what is meant to meet you will recognize you without effort. There may still be moments of uncertainty. That's human. But even uncertainty feels different now. It no longer sends you searching for approval. It invites you inward. Let me ask you something, softly. If you no longer needed to keep everything perfectly balanced, what would you finally allow yourself to want? Stay with that question. Because this turning point isn't loud. It doesn't demand announcement. It reveals itself in how you stand a little taller in your own life. You're not chasing outcomes anymore. You're choosing direction. And direction has momentum. Things begin to change together not because you forced them, but because they were waiting for you to stop living divided. When your inner world aligns, the outer world responds naturally. Not all at once in visible ways, but all at once in meaningful ones. You feel less torn, less fragmented, more whole. This is not the end of a chapter. It's the moment you stop rereading the same page. From here, you move forward with quieter confidence, with fewer explanations, with more trust in what feels true. You don't need to convince anyone of who you are becoming. Your life will reflect it. And as you take that first aligned step, even if it's small. Notice how the ground feels beneath you. Steady, supportive. Because when you live from alignment, you are no longer waiting for change. You are participating in it. And that is why everything changes at once. And if you're still here with me, Libra, take a moment. Notice how quiet it feels inside right now. Not empty, clear. That's not an accident. It means something in you recognized itself tonight. Something ancient, something steady, something that no longer needs to be balanced against anyone else. You didn't come here just to listen. You came to remember. Remember what it feels like to trust your own weight. To stand in your life without apologizing for the space you take. To move forward without splitting yourself in half. This isn't the end of your story. It's the point where you stop negotiating with it. And before you go, let's anchor this moment together. If any part of this message touched you, even quietly, leave a comment below. Just a few words. Tell me what shifted for you tonight. Or simply write, "I choose alignment." Your voice matters here. This is a space for Libra souls who are done carrying more than their share. If this message resonated, take a second to like the video. It helps this energy reach the ones who need it next. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, not because you need answers, but because this journey is still unfolding. More messages are coming. Deeper ones, timed ones. You don't have to rush. You don't have to be ready for everything at once. Just trust yourself enough to stay open. Because the moment you stop chasing balance, life starts meeting you in alignment. And this is only the beginning.